Okay, so welcome to the second half of Psych 123. The first half of the course taught you the basic skills and concepts that are required for you to understand how to conduct a single psychological experiment. Okay, so concepts such as how psychologists operationalize psychological constructs, deciding whether to use within or between subjects' designs, and the various reasons that you would choose one over the other. Concepts about validity and reliability of your measures, as well as being able to identify extraneous variables and confound variables. Understanding these concepts are all super necessary for being able to conduct a single psychological experiment. However, as scientists, as experimental psychologists, conducting the study is actually a very small part of the process. And today we're going to be learning about the broader scientific process that experimental psychologists have to take part in. I'm going to give you two versions of the scientific process. The first version I'm going to call the traditional process. This is the way that psychologists have been conducting research for the majority of time that psychology has been a subject. Unfortunately, there are a lot of problems with the traditional process, namely that it permits what are called questionable research practices, or QRPs, as I'll be referring to them throughout today's lecture. Now, questionable research practices undermine what we as scientists can learn about the world, which is why we conduct experiments. We conduct experiments in order to learn something about reality, to shed light on the world, as this picture nicely demonstrates. Questionable research practices prevent that from happening. Okay? And my goal is for you to understand by the end of today what some of those QRPs are and why they prevent psychologists from learning about the world in which we live. Then, to conclude today's lecture, I'll introduce you to the concept of open science. That is the process of science that is open and transparent and manages to avoid, or is set up to avoid, these questionable research practices from taking place. Okay, so here is what I called the traditional process of science, okay, or traditional publishing. Because when your article gets made available to the world, we say that it's published. Okay, so this is how a paper has traditionally been published. Typically, an experimental psychologist would start by planning a study, and this would include all the things that Sally has taught you in the first part of this course. The psychologist then conducts the study, and they might conduct more than one or two studies, or might conduct more than one study because maybe they want to get the converging evidence. They want a behavioral measure, a self-report measure, and a physiological measure. So perhaps they've got multiple studies that they conduct in order to test their theory. Once they feel they have enough studies and enough of a contribution to make to the literature, they submit to a journal. In psychology, we publish in journals, and once we submit to a journal, there will be an editor assigned to the paper who then recruits other academics, so other experts in the field, to review the paper. Those reviewers will send it back to the author, the original researcher who conducted the study, with a list of questions or clarifications or suggested improvements. They might flat out reject it. So if the paper gets rejected at a journal, the author will probably submit, the researcher who conducted the studies will probably submit it to another journal. But usually, even if it's rejected, you get feedback from the reviewers, so you get suggestions to improve the study. And then once the author, by the way, I'm using the word author interchangeably with researcher. The person that wrote the manuscript is the researcher that conducted the study. Once the author has responded to those comments, and the editor's happy that they've done so, the paper's accepted, and it's published. Now, traditionally, when papers have been published, they've been kept behind a paywall. So if members of the public want to access that paper, they need to pay some money in order to do so. The data that was recruited was typically not shared. So if I'm the researcher, I would recruit all the participants, collect their data, and then I'd write a study based on that data, but not ever share the data, so I'd keep it to myself. I would keep the analyses to myself. So people would have to trust that I have conducted the correct tests and everything is above board and I haven't made any mistakes. And I would also typically not share the materials. So if anybody wanted to replicate my study, they would have to go by the description in my methodology, and oftentimes we have to make that quite brief because there's always a word count that a word limit that we have to follow. So it would be really difficult for other researchers to replicate the study as well. Now, it might be a good idea to pause the video here and consider, is this what you thought the process of science was like? Now, if you're anything like me, I hadn't really considered how papers get published before I started my PhD. So I didn't really know when I was reading these papers what the process was that had resulted in me reading them. Ask yourself, do you think this sounds like a good process? The problem with this traditional model of science is that in between conducting the study and submitting to the journal, there is plenty of room for what have in previous years been called questionable research practices. Okay. Now, broadly speaking, questionable research practices are behaviors that make it more likely to find a result that doesn't exist, to make a type 1 or a type 2 error. They are practices that undermine the statistics that are used, or that make the researcher look like they found evidence for a claim when they in fact did not. As we'll see, it can be the case that the researcher doesn't even know that what they are doing is bad. Okay, it can often feel that they're actually doing the right thing when they make these decisions, and when they choose to do a questionable research practice. It can often seem like it's the right thing to do in that context, and we'll dive into some of the reasons why that's the case. However, nowadays we know far more about how harmful these actions are, and oftentimes researchers will know full well that they shouldn't be engaging in these practices, but they still do. Okay, so part of the open science process that we'll get to later tries to prevent these questionable research practices from happening. We're going to work through, I've listed the questionable research practices at the bottom of this slide. We're going to get through most of these today. They include not reporting measures, dropping studies, excluding participants, running extra participants, and they're the ones we're going to cover today. And then we'll get to next week, the garden of forking paths, which sounds cool, but you'll understand more next week when I explain what it is. And we'll also talk about harking next week. Okay, so the last two on this list we'll get to next week because they're very closely related to the topic of pre-registration, which is the topic of next week's lecture. First, let me introduce you to our example study for today. Let's say there's this lecturer who loves two things. He loves his morning coffee, and he absolutely loves it when the students on his module do well. And let's say that because this lecturer, Neil, has such love for coffee and for his students doing well, he's looking for a way to combine the two. He would love nothing more than to be able to combine students doing well and have them drink some coffee. Now, let's say that when he was discussing this one day in the cafe with his friend Sally, Professor Starbucks overheard what he was saying and claimed to have had the study that Neil was looking for, a study that would unite coffee with students doing well. Professor Starbucks talked Neil through the study. Okay, he claimed that he took two groups of students and gave half of them coffee during their classes and half received no coffee during their classes. At the end of the module, Professor Starbucks then asked the students to rate on a scale from 1 to 7 how alert had they been during class, on the assumption that alert students are better students. And the result was that coffee improves students' alertness, which Professor Starbucks is quick to highlight has been shown in other studies to correlate with exam performance. Okay, so it's a very simple study. Two groups of students, one received coffee, one didn't. They were asked how alert had they been, and they found that students that drank coffee were more alert. As you can imagine, Neil's super happy. Finally, he's got his two favourite things combined, coffee with students doing well, and he declares that he will use the entire Lancaster University's budget to make sure that all students are drinking coffee during their classes. Now, this might seem like a very simple study, but there's reasons to be skeptical about studies like this. Okay, and you should apply a healthy degree of skepticism to all studies that don't really follow open science practices. Let's explore what some of those questionable research practices are. Okay, So the first one on the list was not reporting dependent variables. So this is a very simple thing. This would be if Professor Starbucks had included other measures of student performance. For example, let's say Professor Starbucks measured performance in a weekly test of understanding. So every week students are given a test on the course, like a web-based assessment, that assess their understanding of content taught that week. And let's say he also included a test at a class, recorded the class test performance, which assessed retention. So several weeks after the module had finished, Professor Starbucks gave his students another test to see how much they had actually retained. So in total in his study, Professor Starbucks in fact included 3 measures of performance, but he only reported 1. And the reason why he only reported 1 was because had he had to report the other 2, he would have had to have reported that they claimed no difference. Okay, that he found no difference. So in this example, he found a significant effect on how alert students reported feeling, but however, the benefits of coffee did not appear to improve either the understanding of course content nor the ability to retain that understanding by the end of term. Okay, so in this example, what we've seen is that Professor Starbucks, because he wants people to drink his coffee, has eliminated or dropped, simply not reported, 2 measures because they didn't find the results that he wanted. But nonetheless, it is damaging to the psychological literature and to our understanding of the world, because it makes, by not reporting those measures, it makes it look as if coffee is better for student performance than it actually is. Another questionable research practice is not to report studies that don't provide the result we wanted. So Professor Starbucks is obviously fueled by a multi-billion-dollar company, and so could presumably have conducted many studies. Let's say he conducted 5 studies. Now, unfortunately for Professor Starbucks, let's assume that 4 found no significant difference, but 1 study, this green one over here, found a small significant difference in the predicted direction. Okay, now bearing in mind, if the null hypothesis is true, so the null hypothesis is the finding that there's no effect. So, if there is no effect, and as I said, the null hypothesis is true, we would expect there to mostly be null results, but occasionally a significant result in either direction. Sometimes a coffee group would be better, sometimes the non-coffee group would be better, but we would expect most of the results to be non-significant. Okay, so it's not rare, just because the null hypothesis is true, we do expect to get some significant results, but we don't expect loads of significant results. Okay, so in this case, we've got 4 non-significant results and 1 just significant result. That's pretty indicative that the null hypothesis is true. So what does Professor Starbucks do? Well, if he's conducting questionable research practices, he chooses to publish the 1 study that found an effect, and he chooses to not publish the 4 studies that didn't find an effect. So it should be pretty clear to you that in order that this kind of bias, choosing publish or which study to publish, will bias the literature, because as far as the public's concerned, they think that the only study that's tested whether or not coffee improves student performance was successful. They don't know that there's 4 studies in Professor Starbucks' office, in his filing cabinet, that found the opposite effect. Now, this tendency to not publish what are thought of as failed studies, meaning that they found evidence for the null hypothesis, they were non-significant, is referred to as the file draw problem. And Robert Rosenthal is kind of associated with the file draw problem. He's the person that really highlighted just how much of an issue it is. He said, the file draw problem, for any given research area, one cannot tell how many studies have been conducted, but never reported. The extreme view of the file draw problem is that journals are filled with the 5% of studies that show type 1 errors. In other words, when the null hypothesis is true, but you end up rejecting the null by accident, so you declare there's an effect when there isn't, while the file draws are filled with the 95% of the studies that show non-significant results. Okay. Now, we have good reason for thinking that the file draw problem is a really serious problem. When we look at published studies, even back in 1959, when Sterling looked at published studies, he found that 97% of the studies supported the experimenter's hypothesis. Now, This has been later replicated, this finding, in 2010, so it's persisted across all those decades. Finelli found that psychology was actually the worst offender out of the sciences. Approximately 90% of studies supported the experimental's hypotheses. There are other reasons besides researchers not publishing studies in the file draw problem, one of which we'll be discussing next week, which is harking. Harking is hypothesizing after results are known. So that's when researchers look at the results of their studies and then claim to have always predicted it. So that's one reason why we should might find such a startlingly high rate of studies supporting the experimental hypotheses. But the other reason is that studies that don't support the experimental hypotheses often aren't published. Okay, they're put in the file drawer. So there's some evidence that this is really affecting the results because, let's put it this way, I would say that most of my studies, especially the novel studies that are testing new theories and ideas, most of them are non-significant. Okay, so the fact that we find 97% of studies report significant findings in favor of the experimental's hypothesis is really quite worrying. But as I say, we'll talk about harking next week. Okay, so there's not reporting studies. The next questionable research practices is not reporting conditions. So now there are three groups. Participants either received no drink, a coffee drink, or water for a drink, and they drank it throughout their classes. They were then asked the same question on a scale from 1 to 7. How alert have you been during the class? Let's assume that for this example that that's the only question that they asked. Okay, and then unfortunately for Professor Starbucks, when they include this measure, the results now change. So still, the coffee improved student alertness during classes compared to having no drink. However, the results indicated that drinking coffee showed no benefits above and beyond drinking water. In other words, if Professor Starbucks had been forced to report this condition, he would have had to tell his audience and to tell Neil, who is trying to convince to buy coffee for an entire university, that yes, coffee is better than nothing, but it's not as good as water. And you might imagine Neil might be less willing to buy everyone coffee if he can just ask students to bring a free bottle of water along with them to drink. Okay, so again, by dropping this condition, or by dropping conditions in general, Professor Starbucks is making the result he's looking for look like it's more supported than it actually is. Okay, he's biasing the literature, he's biasing people's understanding of the world by selectively reporting the conditions that make that support his experimental hypothesis the most. Okay, another questionable research practice is it's also possible for research to exclude participants and continuously reanalyze the data until they get the results that they're hoping for. For example, let's say that Professor Starbucks conducted their study in the whole year group, but then excluded participants who don't like coffee, who didn't enjoy the course, and who reported feeling unusually jittery or anxious. You might think those are all fair exclusion criteria, and maybe they are. Maybe if you don't like coffee, you don't want that participant in your classroom, in the study, because they're obviously not going to like coffee. They're not going to like coffee, and then it might not have the effect that you want, and that it makes them more alert. Clearly, if people report feeling unusually jittery and anxious, you might think that they're not going to report necessarily that they felt more alert during the class, or that certainly not that they expect their performance to improve. What if you knew that Professor Starbucks hadn't excluded those participants, however, the effect was completely eliminated? Okay, so at the bottom here, let's assume that Professor Starbucks had to report both before he excluded the participants and after he excluded those participants. Excluding, by the way, just means removing them from the analyses. So you have maybe 100 participants, but 20 of them didn't like coffee, didn't enjoy the course, and reported feeling unusually jittery and anxious. So you take them out of the study and you just analyse the participants that are left. When Professor Starbucks did that, the effect was eliminated. He had to conclude if all participants were included in the study, suggesting that other factors besides drinking coffee might be at play. In other words, if Neil, when he had read this study, had found out that actually, when you just give coffee to everyone, overall there is no effect, there is no improvement, it's only certain people that benefit, he might have been a lot less willing to buy everybody a cup of coffee and to insist that everybody drinks coffee in his classes. Okay, so that's why not reporting an exclusion criteria can be misleading, because it gives the impression that you had found this effect for everyone, but in fact you only found it for a very small subset of people. Okay, the last QRP that we will cover today involves a little bit of statistics. This is not a statistics module, so I will briefly skim over this. Just know, the take-home message from the next couple of slides is that if you intend to calculate a p-value, I think you're all familiar by now with a p-value, you must always specify ahead of time how many participants you will run. Now we'll be covering in week 9 how to specify a sample size. So of course one of the things you need to do as a psychologist is decide how many participants you're going to recruit. And we'll be talking about how you do that in week 9. But just remember the key take-home message, you can't run 50 participants, say, check to see if you have a significant result. So p smaller than 0.05 is what we call a significant result. Then run 10 more if it isn't significant, and check to see if it's significant again. Then run 10 more. And you can't keep doing that until you have a significant result. Okay, so that's the key take-home message. You're not allowed to recruit participants, look at the results, recruit more, look at the results, recruit more, find this time that you have a significant result, and publish that, and not tell anyone that you did that you recruited in stages. So I mentioned there a p-value. Now I'm sure you all know what a p-value is, or I'm sure you know how to use a p-value. Most of you will know that when you want to see if there's a significant effect, you look at the p-value, and if it's smaller than 0.05, it's significant and you declare that there is an effect. If it's not smaller than 0.05, if it's larger, then it's non-significant and you declare that you failed to find an effect. Okay, now I would advise all of you to make it your goal that by the end of the week to memorize this sentence on your slide now. P-values are reported by pretty much every psychological study, and most students know how to look at them, but very few students know the definition. So a p-value is the probability of collecting data as extreme or more extreme as the obtained data, assuming the null hypothesis is true. In other words, the p-value tells you how probable your data were if the null hypothesis is true. So if there's no effect, is your data really likely? Are you likely to find that effect size, that mean difference in student alertness, or are you unlikely to find that effect size? And of course, we in psychology tend to set this the decision criteria to p smaller than 0.05. We say it's so unlikely to be true, the null hypothesis is true, that we accept the alternative or the experimental hypothesis. We reject the null. We say there is a difference here, and it's likely to be due to this hypothesis because this is how I set the study up. Or if it's larger than 0.05, we fail to reject the null. We say our data could have been plausibly obtained if there was no effect here. It's likely to have been obtained if there's no effect. Therefore, we fail to reject the null. We can't rule out that there's nothing going on here. Okay. I'm going to skim over these graphs. The main purpose of these graphs is that if there's an effect that exists, so let's say we know that men tend to be taller than women. So let's say we took somebody's height. We took all the students' height at Lancaster University, and we put them into a big data set, and I took out 100 students, and I compared males to females' height. Because we know that there's an effect that exists in height, we would expect the p-value to be smaller than 0.01. And if we put those 100 people back in, and we took out another 100 people, and we compared their height, males to females, we would expect again a small p-value. Let's now say that we take some data that there isn't an effect. So I don't expect males tend to have taller tables than females. Okay, I accept most males and females by roughly the same tables. If you measure the height of those tables owned by men, they won't be any taller than those tables owned by women. Let's say we put all the table heights of all the students at Lancaster into a big data set, and we took out 100 students, and we compared their table heights. We would expect any p-value. So when the null hypothesis is true, when there's no effect, and we sample from that no effect, we take participants out of that population where there's no effect, and we compare them, the p-value could be anything. It's just as likely to be 0.01 as it is to be 0.99, as it is to be 0.05, as it is, okay? So, by running more participants, you run the risk of the p-value being smaller than 0.05 just by chance alone, okay? So you increase the chance of getting a type 1 error, of rejecting the null hypothesis when it is in fact true. Just by running more participants, you're giving yourself more chance that the p-value will dip below 0.05. Because as you can see in this blue line here, all p-values are equally likely if the null hypothesis is true. There's also the case that if you're willing to continue recruiting participants until you get a p-value smaller than 0.05, then you're guaranteed to get it. At some point, you're guaranteed to get a p-value smaller than 0.05. That means that you're basically promising that you can publish anything. Because if you just keep on recruiting and keep on recruiting, eventually you'll get a significant p-value that's smaller than 0.05, and then you can claim it to be true. Okay, so as I said, psychologists like to use the p-value, and we set it to 0.05 so that if the null hypothesis is true, there's a 1 in 20 chance that we're going to make a type 1 error, that we're going to reject the null hypothesis when it's true. By being willing to continuously recruit participants, it means that you are basically guaranteeing that you would eventually get a type 1 error. Okay. Now again, this sounds all complicated. The take-home message here is that you are not allowed to recruit participants, analyze the results, and then recruit more participants. Okay, so if you don't understand anything I've said on this slide, make sure you know that you have to specify your sample size in advance and make sure that you have enough participants in order to test it then. Okay, so that is all of the questionable research practices I'm going to be covering today. Next week, as I say, we'll be talking about the garden of fork and paths and harking. But make sure you are familiar with those questionable research practices not reporting measures, dropping studies, excluding participants, running extra participants. Make sure you're familiar with why it's that these questionable research practices are bad. Essentially, it means that researchers are able to find evidence for a theory that isn't true. Okay. You might want to start thinking as well about what we could do to avoid it, but we'll be getting to that now as well. I forgot to mention as well, if you want to play around with hacking your own, so I say p-hacking. P-hacking is the term used for when you're basically trying to do all these things. So you exclude participants, see if you've got a significant result, exclude more participants, see if it's significant yet, run more participants, see if it's significant yet. The collective word for actively engaging in all of these questionable research practices is known as p-hacking. Okay, and there's this cool website that you're welcome to go and take a look at. This website used data from, I think, American politics data. And originally, as you can see, ignore that red arrow on the right there. Initially, as you can see, it starts with a non-significant result, and then a p-value of 0.06, so just non-significant. And then, if you look over here, if you choose to deselect senators, so this box here says senators, if you deselect it, suddenly you see that the p-value has become smaller than 0.05. So you excluded certain people, certain types of American politicians, and suddenly the data becomes significant. So do feel free to check out this website if you want to have a little go at what's called p-hacking, and that's basically employing these questionable research practices to find out what becomes significant and what doesn't. Ronald Coase once said that if you torture the data long enough, it will confess to anything. In other words, if you p-hack or do phishing, so phishing is another term for when you're essentially phishing for a p-value less than 0.05, you can make your data essentially say anything. Now, it's a bit of an overstatement, as we'll see shortly, but the bottom line is here, when people hear science, they tend to think that you get data, that's the truth, you read the data, and the data tells you what the world is like. And that's not the case. When you get data, there are many decisions that need to be made whilst analysing that data. For example, which conditions do you report, which participants do you include, and so on. All the things we've discussed so far. And the idea of fishing is that this data set has all these different p-values that are possible, and the researcher basically goes fishing, and he keeps exploring, keeps looking through the pond until he finds his significant p-value, and then he publishes it. Okay, now I just wanted to show you, this is a study that asked researchers the extent that they think they have engaged in certain questionable research practices. So for example, the one on the left here is failing to report all dependent measures. So basically not reporting all the measures that we use. That's the first QRP that we discussed today. And 78% of researchers admitted to having done that. 72% admitted to collecting more data after seeing whether the results were significant. Okay, so at least in 2012, there was good reason to think that the majority of researchers were engaging in questionable research practices. Now, of course, there's all kinds of things here listed that I haven't got into. You're welcome to read the figure or read the paper and read about all these other types of questionable research practices. Notice the toolbars that go up to 100% are prevalence estimate derived from admission rate. So in other words, if so many people are willing to self-admit that they've done that, how many people are actually doing it? Okay, so it's probably close to 100% of researchers have at times conducted some of these questionable research practices. This is a classic study. You don't, again, I'm not going to, it's not required reading, but I do recommend trying to read it. It's one of the most famous psychology papers in the last couple of decades. It basically goes to show that when you are willing to employ several of these questionable research practices, okay, so for example, drop-in measures and so on, your chance of being able to find a significant result increase from 5%, below 5%, to above 60%. Okay, so let's say you get some data and you know there's no effect in there. Okay, so you know there's 0% there's an effect size of 0. Okay, you're measuring the height of male tables versus female tables, and there's no reason to think, oh, you actually know because you're the table salesman and you've sold all the tables to the students, so you know there's no effect. If you take that data and you're willing to drop variables, if you're willing to add more variables when you get a non-significant result, if you're willing to exclude certain participants once you've got those 100 participants, then you are a 60% chance that you can find a significant result. Okay, so basically allow you to declare there's an effect in table size between men and women when you know there is none. Okay, so that's why this paper is so famous, because it really highlighted so many people were engaging in these questionable research practices, and yet this paper really highlighted just how damaging that was to the literature. Because what it means is you can get studies that actually show nothing is going on, and you can get them to show something is going on 60% of the time. Okay, so that is the traditional science process. What we're now going to move on is to what the open science process is and how it differs. Now, there's two main functions of open science. The first is that it makes it opens science up to everybody. So it makes science accessible to all. So you can see some examples here of having open handbooks, open data, open sources, basically letting everyone, including all citizens that aren't scientists, have access to the information and knowledge obtained by scientists, as well as the more practical side of things, such as having access to the data, having access to their publications, their materials, and so on. So that's one function of open science that the process that we're about to discuss. The other function is to make sure that the results we obtain are reproducible and replicable. Now, these two terms are used interchangeably a lot of the time. In this slide, what I'm referring to by reproducible is that when I say I did this study, I used these analyses, and here are my results, that somebody else can take that same study, that same data I just collected, conduct their own analyses and get the same results. Okay, so basically it's a way of showing that I haven't made a mistake in my analyses. Replicable means that if someone takes the study that I've reported and they do it in their own location, maybe rather than look at Lancaster students, they look at York students, that they should, if I'm saying that all Lancaster male students tend to be taller than Lancaster female students, they should then find, and I claim that this is true about all students, not just Lancaster, then somebody who replicates that study in York should find the same effect. They should find that York male students are taller than York female students. So that's what it means to replicate a study. Okay, so reproducible is with the same results. Do those results reproduce? Are they reproducible? Can I get the same results from your data? And replicable is when you have a different sample. So I do a study in one sample, you do a study in another sample, and both attest in my claim that male students are taller than female students on average. Okay, so that's the two purposes, the two functions of open science. So how do we open up science? So as you can see, here is the traditional process: plan a study, conduct the study, submit to journal, respond to reviewer comments, and then eventually get the paper accepted. We can open this up first of all by pre-registering our studies. So pre-registration is something we're going to be spending a whole lecture on next week, but I'm just going to touch on it very gently here. An example of pre-registering is when you basically write down your hypotheses, your methods, your sample size, your exclusion criteria, and any analytic plan, so the analysis that you're going to conduct, before you started recruiting. And the crucial thing about pre-registration is that it has a timestamp on it. So you timestamp it, you print it off, or you put it on the internet, and you can show this was made before I collected this data. Okay. There's a website I use, aspredicted.org, and the aspredicted.org has a simple form. It requires you to say that you haven't started data collection. It requires you to specify what your hypothesis is, so what are you predicting? Specify your dependent variable. How are you going to measure your dependent variable? Specify how many and which conditions will participants be assigned to. This is to stop you from dropping conditions. Specify your analyses. This is so that you can't fish around. You can't do loads of different analyses and just report the one that got you the result you wanted. You can also specify any outliers and exclusions. So let's say you want to exclude people who didn't like coffee, in our Professor Starbucks example. You could specify in advance that you always intended to do that you haven't just done that and shopped around. You can specify your sample size, so you can say I always meant to recruit 100 participants and that's how many I recruited. And you can also specify any other information that you want to specify. So this is pre-registration is a really powerful tool for stopping pretty much most of the questionable research practices. Now, as we'll discuss next week, it's not perfect by any means. It's still possible to game pre-registration. For example, you could write 10 of these and only then make available the one that was that includes the analyses that supported your hypothesis. So this system isn't perfect, but if used honestly, this is the perfect way of showing. And if Professor Starbucks had done this and then showed me his results, Neil would be pretty happy that this study is pretty good, that it's robust. Okay, that there's nothing's been done to the results, no conditions have been dropped, no hypotheses have been made up after the results are known, all this stuff. And my trust in that study increases. The credibility of that study increases just by knowing that all of this was made available before the study was actually conducted. Okay. Now, just to remind you, pre-registration is such an important part of open science that we're going to be discussing it in its own lecture next week. Another thing you can do is upload a preprint. So remember, part of open science is to make science accessible to everybody. Now, a preprint is just a copy of your paper before you submit it. Okay, so once I've written my paper, just before I go to submit it to a journal, I can upload it as a preprint. Now, you could do this anywhere. You could put this on your own website. you could post it anywhere. This website is the one that is most psychologists tend to be using at the moment, I think. Site Archive is how you pronounce that. And here's an example of one of my papers. So Jared Piazza, who's a lecturer in this department, and I uploaded this paper just before I then submitted it to a journal, and it's currently undergoing revision. But if you wanted to read it, you are able to go along to this website. You can download it and give it a read. And the purpose of this is that it's completely free. It avoids copyright because I uploaded it before I submitted it to any journal. And there's also other benefits involved, such as I've already had several researchers contact me and discuss this paper. So it doesn't keep it behind closed doors. It invites review by pretty much any reader that's interested in the topic. And it's really that simple. It's just about uploading your preprint somewhere so that other people can read it before you've submitted it to your journal, and then it becomes copyrighted by the journal if they go on to publish it. Now, there is some good evidence out there. This is in the field of biology, but there's no reason to think it would be different for psychology, that uploading a preprint increases the impact of the article. So here you can see that articles that have a preprint are more cited, so that means that papers that are published after them tend to cite articles with a preprint more than they tend to cite articles that don't have a preprint. Articles with a preprint tend to be more discussed than articles that don't have a preprint for obvious reasons. They're more widely available and easily accessible by members of the public. And we see this effect across different mediums online. Okay, so in terms of incentivizing uploading a preprint, it is kind of scary because you're putting your research out there that it hasn't been peer reviewed, you haven't got feedback yet. But then the benefits are your work becomes more widely discussed, and you actually get feedback from members of the public and scientists that are looking at peer reviews, preprints. Okay, so pre-registering and uploading a preprint. Another thing you could do is submit to what's called an open access journal. So let's say I am interested in this paper published in Psychological Science. It's called The Negative Effect of Smartphone Use on Academic Performance May Be Overestimated. Okay, so I'm thinking, this sounds like an interesting paper, but unfortunately, I can't get access to it because, as you can see on the right over here, there's a paywall, and I don't want to spend $34 in order to get access to one article. This is why, now, of course, the university pays us a huge amount of money in subscription so that we can access this for free. But if you weren't at university, you would have to pay money in order to access this. And there's an argument that the majority of science that is conducted is actually bought and paid for by the public, by taxpayers' money. So it's kind of bizarre that taxpayers paid for the salaries of the researchers. They paid for the money that paid the participants, essentially. The taxpayers funded this research, and now taxpayers are having to pay money in order to access it. So, I don't know what that's there for. Fortunately, most journals now offer an open access. Open access means that anybody is able to access the article. And there's different levels. There's gold standard, which basically means that articles are available for free online. So here's an example of open access articles that were published in the Journal of Experimental Social Psychology. And anybody can go along and click on them. That's called gold access. Green access, or green open access, is essentially they allow you to make available the manuscript on a preprint website. So that once you've published your research, you can make a preprint publicly available. Now, almost all journals allow that these days. Okay, but gold standard is when the journal themselves make the article available. Now, of course, you may be wondering why don't all researchers just make their to submit to a journal that allows open access, gold standard open access, where the final product, the final article, is made available for free. The reason why is that it costs money. So if I wanted to publish open access in a Journal of Experimental Social Psychology, I'd have to pay approximately £2,000 to £4,000 in order for that article to be free for the public. So of course, journals have to run. Journals cost money. So it's not. They can't. The charge has to go somewhere, and at present, that charge goes to the researcher wanting to make their research open access. There are examples of new journals that are just opening. Collabora and Metapsychology are two such journals that are completely open. So when you submit to them, you don't. I believe there's some differences in terms of the kind of fees that are necessary or required to pay. Some are completely free, some do include a fee, but they're completely open access, and their purpose is to make sure that everybody has access to the knowledge and information that science produces. Okay. Lastly, for today, you also, when engaging in open science practices, you should look to share everything about the study. Share as much as possible. Okay, they say sharing is caring. So when what kind of things could you share? Once you've been told that this paper is getting published, well, the first thing you should do, if you want people to believe that your study is a really credible study, is share the pre-registration. Let people know that all of the things that you plan to do, all of the things you report are exactly above board, open, and this is what you intended to do before you conducted the study. So basically what you're telling, by making the pre-reg available, you're telling readers that you haven't engaged in any questionable research practices. The conclusions you draw are based solely on what you intended to do before you could see the results. Okay, you can share your materials. That enables replication. So if I want to replicate a study and I find that that study that I want to replicate has made all the materials available online, that saves me so much time, and it saves me from having to guess that I've accurately replicated the methodology from their methodology section. If they just share the materials, it's there and easy for me to access. Sharing their data and sharing their analyses. So I can see in advance, I can recreate my own analyses. I can also try to recreate their analyses. Okay. Now it's very easy to share all of these materials. Probably the most popular way of sharing your science materials is on the OSF, the Open Science Framework, which is osf.io. And here's an example of one of my projects where, again, it's the same study that Jared and I uploaded as a preprint. And as you can see down here at the bottom, it's essentially the OSF is a cloud storage like Google Drive or OneDrive. And you can see that we've uploaded our analysis script, our R script here. We've uploaded our data set, which is this CSV file. We've uploaded our pre-registration. And this QSF file is a Qualtrics file. That's basically all of our materials in one file. Okay, and just by doing this, you can see that at present it's not yet public. So we haven't clicked this button, make public, because we haven't yet had the paper accepted. But once we get it accepted, we'll make this public, and then everyone that reads our paper will have access to all of these materials. Okay, so it's that easy. And that is essentially the open science process. So as you can see, because the traditional process has so long established, what's happened over the last decade is people have come up with ways of adding practices, so pre-registration, uploading preprints, submitting open access journals, and sharing everything, that make the research process far more A, transparent, and B, accessible. Okay, now that's the end of this lecture. What I would like you to do before the start of next week's lecture is make sure that you are able to outline the traditional scientific process. So from planning a study to publishing a study and all the steps in the middle. That is essentially what most psychologists are doing, most experimental psychologists at least. Then make sure you can name the QRPs. So look at my list of questionable research practices. Don't just learn them off by heart, but understand the negative impact that they have. Essentially, they all bias the literature. They all make the experimenter look better at predicting differences than they are, and they make it possible to make differences appear when none actually exist. Okay, and then finally, make sure you can outline the open science process that makes science open to all and reproducible. In other words, pre-registration, uploading preprints, sharing your data, what an open access journal is. Okay, if you can do those things, then you've learned a lot this week, and you'll have an excellent basis and foundation for learning for the rest of the course. In the meantime, have a fantastic week.